Welcome to Module 5. We're going to be looking today specifically at some strategies and some of pulling together the last 4 modules and some of the information from the last 4 modules. So hopefully you'll find this to be something that you can sort of take away directly into your classrooms. So let me just go ahead and get this going. First thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have you stop the video for a minute because we're going to do something where I'm going to have you right before and then after this video. So you should be able to find in our course materials a packet called the Tennessee Center for the Study and Treatment of Dyslexia, their student literacy profile. And what I want you to do is I just want you to take a couple minutes and explore their profile. And I think that what this demonstrates is a lot of what we were talking about last class is that really to be able to profile or get a real visual understanding of a student's literacy, it is a very complex idea. So what I want you to do is, after reviewing the various descriptions of background information, skills, and profiles, find a metaphor that demonstrates your understanding of what we have to take into account when we are considering a student's literacy profile. I want you to write about a half a page to a page. It says 2 pages here, but a page is fine. Explanation of your choice of visual. So put your visual right onto your document and then go ahead and kind of explain that visual in your own words. It doesn't have to use a lot of the technical terms, but in your own words, kind of explain your visual. Then I want you to hold that. And then don't turn it in yet, because then after you view this, I'm going to have you go back to that and I'm going to have you kind of reconsider this, okay, in context of some of the strategies that we have. All right, so I'm going to have you stop now, and hopefully you'll be able to do this, and then just start the video back when you're ready. And I'll look awkwardly at the camera for a minute. Okay, I hope that you had a chance to write down your thoughts and come up with your metaphor, but I wanted to show you a metaphor that is famous. It's actually a metaphor very closely related to the simple view of reading. This is Scarborough's reading rope. And it really looks at, you'll notice that it has some of the same components, the same 2 components of Scarborough's, or of the simple view of reading, which is language comprehension and decoding skills. And what it does is it kind of weaves them together, and it demonstrates this idea that they just get tightly wound together, that that these are strands and threads, and like any fabric, all of the threads have to be tightly wound in order for the fabric to be its strongest. And so that is a metaphor that that you probably have seen, Scarborough's reading rope. It's very closely related to the simple view of reading, and it demonstrates this idea that sometimes when we think in things in metaphors, it helps us to take these abstract ideas and kind of get some new understanding by putting them into some kind of a concrete term. Okay, so thinking about simple view of reading, thinking about this Scarborough's reading rope, and all the things that have to come together, right, for a student to become a skilled reader. Let's now look at this objective. We're going to identify specific strategies that build students' phonemic and phonetic awareness. We're going to consider how this can be done in an integrated approach that's appropriate for older readers. Thinking about the fact that our older readers are unique from our younger readers and that they're often working through literacy in content-specific areas, meaning that they might be doing their reading and writing in a content-specific classroom, such as in a science classroom or a math classroom. We're also going to identify some resources that you might want to explore further to support your instruction. Okay, so the first thing and most important idea I want you to have in mind as we move into this is that we really need to consider decoding instruction as an integrated support. We constantly want to be thinking about this in terms of integration. When we're looking at phonics and intentional phonics instruction, systematic phonics instruction in the younger grades, often we are actually teaching those skills often in isolation or largely in isolation. That's why you have those like decodable readers. They're books that are really designed to be decoded. They don't have much of a story. We probably have all used those, but the reason for those is because it's appropriate. It's developmentally appropriate at that age, and there are other things that we do to develop a reader's identity that is a little bit more on the effective side. rather than on the skill-based side. But we need to remember that older students, that's inappropriate. Older students have to have their decoding supports delivered as an integrated instruction. And so while we're working on trying to build some of these lagging skills, we want to consider the context. We want to think about like what discipline specific needs might they have. And we also want to consider the learning needs. So it's an integrated support. We're never not also developing their language comprehension. And sometimes we're developing both their language comprehension and their word recognition in the context of a very specific instructional setting, i.e., in the context of a specific class, maybe for a literature class, maybe for a history class. So this brings us to this idea that we want to think about academic language skill as often being sort of integrated within the language and specific to the fields of study. So we've all probably seen, or the Common Core State Standards is widely used, this idea of tiered vocabulary, and this idea that we really want to build our students' capacity in Tier 2. And then Tier 3 is the one that we really want to think about in terms of when we're talking about an integrated approach to decoding, when these Tier 3 ideas matter. So Tier 1 are your basic words. Those are the ones that your students should be able to do automatically. And Tier 2 are high frequency academic words that are found across subjects. Those are things like nonetheless. I'd like to prioritize. These are parallel. So these are words that you'll see generally in academic, not things that you generally would say like at the family reunion, but words that you might use like in a classroom setting. Tier 3 are words that appear in specific subjects or fields of study. And so these are things like, you'll see these in the green here: integer, estuary, alliteration, isotope, mitosis. So these are words that you really need your students to be able to understand them in the context. We also have to be careful because some Tier 3 words can also be Tier 2 words, meaning that, for instance, suspension. The suspension of disbelief is a common term. You use that in theater, you use that in literature, things like that. It means to hold off on, right? To suspend something. But in a chemistry class, the suspension has a very different idea. And so we need to also be aware of, there are some words, or many words actually, that maybe have a general meaning, which would make them a Tier 2 word meaning. But we have to be aware of when those, when we put them into a certain context, when they actually put on and have a discipline-specific meaning. So what I want to do today is I want to go through some strategies that you can do in order to build your students' phonetic and phonomic awareness, right? How can they start to develop some of these like language practices that maybe didn't get developed appropriately in their younger ages, but how can we do it in ways that can still sort of be developing their critical thinking skills? So this is an activity that I just love because I think it really develops a lot of skills at once. And it's fun. It's a puzzle, right? So students in middle and upper grades actually like puzzles. So it would make a great like seat work, things like that. But as you do this, I want you to think about how this would also be a good activity where you can, if your student's lacking some phonomic or phonetic skills, you can see that they are actually developing those while they're working on this. Plus, it's a lot of fun. So I encourage you to go ahead and have a shot at this. So the way word ladder works is I'm going to give you a word, and then I'm going to give you an instruction. And in that instruction, you're going to change the word. So the first word at the top of the ladder is wash. And I think this one has 12 steps, but your ladders have different steps, and you go from top to bottom. And so at the top of this one is wash. And the command I'm going to give you is change one letter to make a way to prepare potatoes, often with gravy. So wash becomes mash. Now change one letter to make a long pole rising from the deck of a ship that supports sails and riggings. Mash becomes mast. Change one letter to make the opposite of least. Mast becomes most. Change one letter to make a pole set upright in the ground, often used to mark or indicate something. Most becomes post. Change one letter to make a harbor town where ships can load and unload their cargo. Post becomes port. Change T to a U, and then rearrange the letters to make a way to dispense or serve liquid from a pitcher or a bottle. Port becomes pour. take away one letter so that the word means belonging to us. Poor becomes our. Add one letter to make a word that means belonging to you. Your. Change one letter to make another word for 60 minutes. Your becomes our. Take away the last letter and replace with two and make a breed of dog used for hunting. Hound. Add one letter to make it more than one hound. Hounds. Change the OU to one vowel, making a word that goes with number 1, wash, and number 9, your, and makes you healthy. Hands. So this word ladder is wash your hands. Appropriate for those of us. I'm taping this at the in the middle of the pandemic, so it seemed like an appropriate ladder for word ladder for me to share. So this is an example of the kinds of wordplay that you want to bring into your classroom, and you want to do it in ways that are fun and appropriate for your students. And something like a puzzle is really, really good. What we want to think about is really, because our students are lacking these skills, but we're also continuing on, we want to think about the fact that they have a rickety bridge. I just saw an episode of the TV show Snowfall, and in the episode, the two characters are crossing this bridge, and I think it's in Costa Rica, and it's this rickety old wooden bridge, and I just would never have crossed it ever in a million years, right? And that idea that our students often have, if we think of fluency to me is a bridge. Fluency is the ability for your students to be able to automatically read and appropriately read. So there's automaticity, and then there's also prosody in fluency. And in younger grades, our students will get fluency goals, meaning that we want them to be able to read a certain number of words correct per minute. So we want them to read at a certain rate. And prosody is that we want them to be able to read in a way that is appropriate for the task. So if there's a question mark at the end of a sentence, they're asking it in a way that indicates, is this a question? And when there's a suspense, they're kind of slowing down to build the suspense. So prosody is the second part of fluency. And really, prosody is probably obviously the harder one to measure, because it's not like you can sit with a stopwatch and count the number of words that they read in a minute. But it also is probably, for our purposes, an extremely helpful way for us to be able to identify when that bridge is rickety, when that student doesn't have a very strong bridge to be able to move from decoding to comprehending, right? So if we think of decoding as being able to understand what's on the page, but comprehend, or to be able to literally read the words on the page, but comprehending, being able to understand what those words mean. Fluency is a nice bridge for us to be able to understand that. And so a lot of what we're going to I'm going to share with you today, these are really strategies that can help to build your students' fluency. And they really are often applications of strategies that are used in the younger grades, that use with younger students. But we can talk about how they might work in an upper grade. Okay. So one thing that is very often used in the lower grades is a choral reading, meaning groups of students read sections or parts. I thought this was a lovely example of a middle school classroom that used choral reading, but you can see that the choral reading, it's done with a different level of sophistication and in a way that is appropriate. So let me just share with you this with you. Sorry, skip ad.
Sick by Shel Silverstein. I cannot go to school today, said little Peggy Ann McKay.
I have the measles,
And the mumps,
a gash,
a rash, and purple bumps.
My mouth is wet.
Okay, so we can see this is very likely something that was done in a classroom or in a middle school classroom, possibly as a theater exercise. But there's a lot that you could do in this that would be having the students take a text and maybe dividing it into speaker parts and bringing them together and into separate pieces, because you'll see how when you're working with a group, you kind of have to be able to understand and follow the flow the group is set, right? So that's one.
Sick by Shel.
So that's one strategy. Another strategy that we can think about in understanding repeated readings, being able to do something over and over again. So I have a stage here Repeated readings, reader theater. So, another strategy you could do is have your students turn a section of a text into a reader's theater. And it doesn't just have to be literature. You could also think of this creatively, like maybe you could look at it in terms of looking at a transcript from uh, um, a primary source in history classroom, things like that. So, or even they could do some research and turn that research into a theater piece, like different cells, conversing with one another or something like that. But the idea here is to give them practice and to give that student repeated readings, have them build fluency by not just doing cold reads, by becoming familiar with the text and thereby developing the ability to read that text with more automaticity and prosody, more being able to read it more fluidly. Another thing that I want you to consider is how you can use poetry, and you can think about this in terms of, and there's a lot of resources out there, hip hop and rap and all of that. So you want to explore poetry and all of its modern influences as well. So I have another video here. This is Elizabeth Acevedo, who won the 2018 book award for her book Poedex. And I want you to listen. This is really spoken word poetry, which is a powerful, powerful genre to bring into the classroom. And I want you to see and think about what it would be like for a student to just read maybe one passage like she does. She reads her book is cut up into very short pieces. But if our students were to do like repeated readings of this and performances of a small section like she does in this presentation that she gave when she won the National Book Award. I'm just going to keep it smaller.
The first words, pero tú no eres fácil, is a phrase I've heard my whole life. When I come home with my knuckles scraped up, pero tú no eres fácil. When I don't wash the dishes quickly enough, or I forget to scrub the tub, pero tú no eres fácil. Sometimes it's a good thing. When I do well on an exam, or the rare time I get an award, oh, pero tú no eres fácil. When my mother's pregnancy was difficult, and it was all because of me, because I was turned around and they thought that I would die, or worse, that I would kill her. So they held a prayer circle at church, and even Father Sean showed up to the emergency room. Father Sean, who held my mother's hand as she labored me into the world, and Papi paced behind the doctor, who said this was the most difficult birth she had ever been a part of. But instead of dying, I came out wailing, waving my tiny fist. And the first thing Papi said, the first words I ever heard, pero tú no eres fácil. You sure ain't an easy one. What I wish my parents would know. My mouth cannot write.
So that's another example of bringing in, if you wanted to bring in some of these like popular culture references, things like that. There's a lot that you can think about when you're talking about even the types of text that you bring in. Another thing, some simple ideas that you can use when you're working with students that are struggling because they have lack of decoding is whenever we're introducing new words, you want to model awareness of like phonomic and phonetic awareness. So you want to do things like you want to slowly introduce a new word, slowly sharing each syllabi. I'm sorry, I'll change that right now. Each syllabi, so that your syllable. I'm sorry, I'm like syllable. Oh my lord. Can I spell that right? No. All right. You can also think about how to model new and difficult words in context. So give them examples of it. Maybe you can take time to let students practice pronunciation. So if you're giving a word, actually have the class give it back, read the word back to you or read a list of words back to you. So these are some simple ideas that we can do, knowing that some of our students, especially if we know particularly that we have some students that are struggling with decoding. And we always, always, always want to remember the role that vocabulary instruction can play in helping to support those students. And to be clear, vocabulary instruction, when I first started teaching, we used this little red book. I can't remember what it was called, but I bet a lot of you either used it or had it as students, because every single quiz that was provided with this particular vocabulary program was also available online for the students to find and be able to get the answers to. So it wasn't very helpful. But the problem with that program was that it was a list of random words. And that's really not what we know. We need to know more about the vocabulary instruction. But what we do know is that that's not the kind of vocabulary instruction that's really going to support these struggling readers. Instead, we want to do things like we want to anticipate when we're about to read a passage, or we're about to ask our students to read a passage, that anticipate what the difficult words are. What are the words that our students are not going to be able to get through themselves? We want to think about words that have that shifting meaning. So I talked earlier about the idea of suspension. We want to be able to identify and prepare our students for that fact. And then we want to make sure that we're relating the vocabulary that we're instructing, and that it relates directly to the work that we're doing in the class, the text that they're reading, or the lecture that you're about to give. One really important idea that we want to think about, and a lot of people talk about Greek and Latin roots, and that's really important. Remember in the last module, we talked about the idea that when we group things together, it becomes easier to learn them. And so morphology is really just a way of grouping things together by being able to think about how they're related by looking at the forms of the words. And so when we think about things like sexist, sexism, what we're starting to be able to identify are in sexist, right? They're grouped together, and the meaning becomes easier because they're in this group. And morphology is a way of grouping things together, okay? We want to think about, with morphology, we want to think about things like prefixes and suffixes, the affixes that we want. So we want to teach our students affixes, which would either be pre, that come before, or post, that come after. So thinking about and teaching those and having them maybe be able to identify what they all have in common. Like giving your students all like a prefix, and then asking them to come up with a list of related of words that they can think with that, and now try to find some themes. How are they related? So morphology is about studying the part, or sharing the parts, and so what we have is the word can be broken down to the prefixes, the suffixes, and then the root. And so what we want to think about then is how we can use those root words to get our student, or morphology word parts, to get our students thinking about a word meaning. There's a fun episode that you could consider using. It's the third episode, I believe, in season 1 of The Office, and it's a section where Dwight is making changes to their healthcare, and the student and the people are like reporting out their ailments, and they actually practice like morphologic problem solving by trying to figure out what these things could be. And so some of the diseases that were submitted to Dwight, you could have your students kind of, by thinking about related words, you can have them have fun, come up with some definitions. Some of them, I'll warn you, are not appropriate. So, you want to think about whether or not you can use this in your classroom. But it is a fun idea, and even just putting these in front of them would be something that you could do and have them talk about. And then they can, add their own diseases. What diseases will they report to Dwight? The other thing you can think about is Greek and Latin roots. So if the affixes are the beginning and the ends, the Greek and Latin roots are the root part of the word, the main part of the word. And so Greek and Latin roots are something that we can consider teaching. And so here's one where I'm going to show you. This is a series. They teach a number of roots words every, they've got videos for each root word. So let me see if this will play. For some reason it doesn't want to play.
Greetings, welcome to Latin and Greek root words. Today's root word is manu, meaning hand. Manu, meaning hand, plus al, meaning of, pertaining to, or having the form of, make manual, meaning done with your hands. His job involved a lot of manual labor. Man, meaning hand, plus kul, meaning little, make manacle, meaning small circles used to bind the wrist, handcuffs. Police officers use a type of manacle called handcuffs. Manu, meaning hand, plus script, meaning writing, make manuscript, meaning book written by hand or not published yet.
Okay,
The
I'm going to
aspiring author hoped a
stop there, but you get the idea that there's a lot of resources on the web for you to think about how you could use Greek and Latin word roots to be able to teach students to start to think about. So now they might not have known manacle, but they might have known manual and manuscript, and maybe that got them to be able to kind of think about this has something to do with hands, right? And so this is just a strategy. It's a really good strategy. If students already have decoding skills, what's nice is it is not just targeted at your students that are struggling. It is appropriate to use this for students that have really strong decoding skills too, because it just gives them a problem strategy. When they face an unknown word, it's a strategy that they can use. Okay, so that's, oh, sorry, what my problem is today. Okay. Another thing I want to share with you then is, there isn't just one strategy, and that's one of the things that we have to come to grips with, is that there's a lot. This is really going to be a process of your being able to like build up these strategies, and you're sort of thinking about and building up your access to kits. So one of the things I wanted to show you here is Ohio Department of Education has a literacy school toolbox, toolbox, and you can see that there's, what I love about this is you can look to think about what are some of the things that I want to know. So if, for instance, you suspect that you have a student who's really has decoding issues, you might try to put them into a universal screener. And so here's some ideas, or here's some access to some universal screeners. What I wanted to show you is there's some good things here for adolescent literacy. So in here, I'm going to go over, this is the, for adolescent literacy, they share this. I'm going to actually go over some of the ideas in that book. But the ODE Literacy Toolkit is something that you can really consider. It's also one of the things that they have in there, just to say, for you to think about, is the reading endorsement and information for reading endorsement. And traditionally, that's been something that has been pursued by teachers of the preschool through third grade. And I would submit, as somebody who now is teaching in the reading endorsement programs, that there's an important role for us. We need to be developing better or specialized knowledge in for reading instruction or literacy instruction for our older students. And so that's something else for you to consider. No matter what you're teaching, we're all, as the old adage says, we all teach reading and writing, which we do. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to talk about then is sort of one of the resources in the toolkit was the Institute of Education Sciences in the Department of Education. These are the same people that do the What Works Clearinghouse. And they have access, it's 2008, which again, I think is kind of indicative of the fact that we really don't have enough information out there, that I'm sharing with you something that's more than a decade old. That we just don't have enough information out there for adolescent literacy and how to meet these needs. But in this resource, Improving Adolescent Literacy, there's the recommendations that are shared for specific things and what the level of evidence for those are. And providing explicit vocabulary instruction has very strong evidence of being able to support for our students. And that's the one that would go into the decoding, teaching the decoding skills. Providing direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction also has strong. Providing opportunities for extended discussion of text and meaning and interpretation is moderate. And that's something that hopefully we're doing in our classrooms, allowing our students to talk about the text that they're reading. Increasing student motivation and engagement, that's been shown to have a moderate level of influence on achievement. And then making intensive and individualized interventions for struggling readers that can be provided by trained specialists, that is strong. And I know that many of us are not in situations where we have that multi-tiered support system within our schools. And so that's, something that as you are working through your problems, these are conversations we might want to be having with our administration, because I think there is this assumption or this sort of belief that these skills are being handled in the younger grades. And there's a lot of evidence that we're doing a better job. Certainly, our third grade reading guarantee scores are demonstrating that growth, but we're not seeing a lot of evidence that's being sustained beyond the third grade. And so that's something that we want to really think about. And so, I just leave that out there. If you don't have a lot of resources in the school for intensive and individualized intervention for those students that are demonstrating to have really, really significant gaps, that is something that you want to think about. How can I go about engaging in those conversations? One of the things I wanted to share with you is one of the strategies that was identified as also being strong is that I'm explicitly teaching reading strategies. And these are the strategies. These are kind of like based on what do good readers do. And so these are strategies that are taught, often explicitly taught, so that our students are building these skills. And so these are things like being able to predict, to visualize, to question, to connect, to identify, infer, and evaluate. And you can imagine if I'm going to pick one of those strategies to teach, like let's say I want to teach connection, where I'm going to have my students to think about what you already know about the text and find ways to relate that text to yourself, to other texts in the world around you. Well, if that's a reading strategy that I want to develop, I want you to think very, very carefully about what texts you're going to use, right? There are going to be certain texts that are going to be better positioned and are going to position our students better to develop that skill. So this is not related really to decoding, but because we're doing this integrated approach, I think it's important for us to recognize that often our decoding and our vocabulary instruction is going to also be going on as we're teaching our students reading strategies. And you might not even realize that you're teaching them reading strategies. Content area disciplinary teachers are constantly asking students to maybe identify, right? Certainly to evaluate and to make inferences based on what they read. And so these are things that we want to think about. They're not just about teaching and reading in an ELA classroom, but we're actually doing them probably quite a bit throughout our day with our students. Okay, so here are some of the things that when we looked at when they talked about like what are two, the two areas that I said are kind of like related to what we're looking at today, struggling readers and decoding. So providing explicit vocabulary instruction in that document, they talk about this idea of dedicating classroom time for vocabulary instruction, providing exposure to new words in multiple contexts and with practice, offering a lot of opportunities for your students to use the new words, and then developing these strategies to make them independent vocabulary learners, which goes back to this idea of morphology. So if you think about it, think about some of the things that we talked about. So for instance, provide exposure to new words in multiple contexts and with practice. Those would be things like choral readings and reading theater. Sufficient opportunities to use new words, again, those would be some of those strategies. Dedicate classroom time to instruction. That's one of the things that, when we're talking about even doing something like a word ladder as an opening activity. And then morphology and Greek and Latin roots are things that you can think of in terms of how to build word attack strategies. Those also, we didn't talk about them, but you could also help them look at inference, like, use context clues to help them to consider what a word might mean. So when we're talking about what to do to make available intensive and individualized interventions for those really struggling students, one of what we need to think about is what are our screening assessments. Screening assessments are not going to be things that classroom teachers are doing. They're not going to be your reading quizzes that you're offering every day. If you have a student that's struggling with those reading quizzes, that's when the screeners, you need to see if somebody is qualified to give them a screening test to see, it could be as simple as that working memory. It could be that they're actually decoding everything okay, but they're not moving it into out of their working memory, and so they're losing it very quickly. But it could actually be that they're decoding, that they have some problems with decoding. Then you want to think about, once you have those screeners and what needs are established through that screening, what specific gaps are being identified, then you align your interventions and assess with those assessment results. And the last thing is you want to do is you want to match the intensiveness to the need. So if you have your students that have like some gaps, we really don't want to be too intensive in our intervention strategies beyond the need, because what we might do is frustrate them, and we actually might keep them from being able to develop the language comprehension skills, right? So it's always a balancing act, and we want to think about how intense is the need, and then we match the intensiveness to the need. So we don't want to go too far one way or the other. We want to make sure that our students that are really, really struggling, they also have all of those supports in place that they need to be able to be successful. All right, so at this point, I'm going to ask you to go back to your opening paper that you wrote and where you created that metaphor. What does literacy look like? Okay. And I want to return to your metaphor and your reflection. And then I want you to think about one strategy or idea that resonated with you through this little lecture. And I want you to explain in a short paragraph how this aligns with your metaphor for literacy. So after viewing this, after considering your literacy, how can we put these things together? So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do that activity in your on your paper, and then you'll be able to turn it in with both. Okay. All right.